Get this old man out of the premises right now!
A 77-year-old man in a faded denim jacket stood at the entrance of the Norfolk Naval Station banquet hall, and the first thing the security guard noticed was his shoes. They were old brown leather boots, cracked along the toe line, the kind of boots a man wears when he has stopped caring what the world thinks of him. The guard, a young petty officer named Jennings, stepped forward with one hand raised and said, "Sir, this is a private event. I'm going to need to see your invitation." The old man reached into his jacket pocket slowly and his fingers came back empty. He looked at Jennings with calm grey eyes and said quietly, "I don't have one." Jennings nodded the way people nod when they have already made up their minds. "Then I'm sorry, sir. I can't let you through." What happened next made Rear Admiral David Chen rise from his chair so fast he knocked over a glass of water, and by the time the old man reached the head table, 3 retired captains were standing at attention with tears running down their faces. If this story moves you, take a moment right now and type the word honour in the comments, because what this man carried with him for 50 years deserved to be spoken out loud a long time ago. His name was Earl Joseph Briggs, and for the last 23 years he had lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store in Chesapeake, Virginia. The apartment smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. The walls were bare except for a single photograph near the kitchen window, and if you looked closely at that photograph, you would see a young man in a Navy flight suit standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier, with the ocean stretching out behind him like a sheet of dark iron. Earl did not talk about that photograph. He did not talk about much of anything, really. His neighbours knew him as the quiet man who walked to the grocery store every Tuesday morning, who sat on the bench outside the post office in the afternoons reading paperback westerns, and who never raised his voice above the volume of a normal conversation. The woman who ran the hardware store downstairs, Linda Faulkner, had known Earl for 15 years, and the most personal thing he had ever told her was that he preferred black coffee and that he once had a dog named Captain. She did not know he had served in the Navy. She did not know that for a period of 4 years in the early 1970s, Earl Briggs had been one of the most dangerous men flying in Southeast Asian airspace. She did not know any of this because Earl had decided a long time ago that the things he had done in the dark deserved to stay in the dark, and he had kept that promise to himself with the kind of discipline that only a man trained to fly alone into hostile territory at night could maintain. The reunion was officially called the USS Constellation Veterans Association Annual Gathering, and it had been held every year for the past 31 years at various locations along the East Coast. This year it was at the Norfolk Naval Station, and the guest list included over 400 former crew members, aviators, and support personnel who had served aboard the Constellation during her active years. The event was coordinated by a retired commander named Bill Hargrove, a meticulous man who ran the reunion the way he had once run his department aboard ship, which meant every name was checked, every seat was assigned, and every invitation was accounted for. Earl Briggs was not on the list. He had never attended a reunion. He had never joined the Veterans Association. He had never responded to a single one of the letters that had been sent to various addresses over the years trying to locate former crew members. As far as the association was concerned, Earl Briggs was either dead, unreachable, or uninterested. The truth was simpler than any of those options. Earl had spent 50 years believing he did not deserve to sit at a table with the men he had served alongside because Earl carried something inside him that was heavier than any medal or commendation. He carried the memory of the men who did not come home, and he carried the specific and unbearable weight of believing he could have done more to save them. But something had changed 3 weeks before the reunion. Earl had been sitting in the waiting room of the VA clinic in Norfolk for a routine checkup when he picked up a copy of a veterans magazine from the table beside him. He flipped through it without much interest until he saw a small notice near the back. It was a quarter-page announcement for the USS Constellation reunion, and it included a photograph of the ship taken from the air during her final deployment. Earl stared at that photograph for a long time. He stared at the angle of the flight deck. He stared at the catapult tracks. He stared at the island superstructure where the air boss had once stood shouting instructions into the wind. And something shifted inside him, the way a locked door shifts when the wood around it has finally rotted enough to give way. He tore the page out of the magazine and folded it into his shirt pocket, and when he got home that evening he sat at his kitchen table and looked at it under the light for almost an hour. He did not call anyone. He did not request an invitation. He simply decided, in the quiet way that Earl Briggs decided everything, that he was going to go. He was 77 years old, and he was tired of carrying the weight alone, and if he was going to die sometime in the next few years, which his doctor had gently suggested was a possibility given the state of his lungs, then he wanted to see the ship one more time, even if the ship was just a room full of old men who remembered her. The morning of the reunion, Earl put on the best clothes he owned. This was not saying much. He wore clean khaki trousers, a white button-down shirt that was slightly too large for him because he had lost weight over the past year, and the faded denim jacket he wore everywhere. He did not own a suit. He had not owned a suit in over a decade. He drove his old pickup truck the 40 minutes from Chesapeake to Norfolk, and when he arrived at the naval station gate, the first complication arose. He did not have a military ID. His had expired years ago, and he had never renewed it. He told the gate guard he was there for the reunion, and after some back and forth and a phone call to someone inside, they gave him a temporary visitor pass and directed him to the banquet hall. He parked his truck at the far end of the lot between two newer vehicles that made his truck look like it belonged in a museum, and he walked slowly toward the building. His left knee ached the way it always ached when he walked on concrete, a souvenir from an ejection in 1973 that had compressed 3 vertebrae and torn the cartilage in both knees. He did not limp exactly, but he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had been broken and reassembled more than once. When he reached the entrance, Petty Officer Jennings was waiting with a clipboard and the kind of expression that young men in uniform wear when they have been given a simple job and intend to do it by the book. "Good morning, sir. Name, please." Earl said his name. Jennings ran his finger down the list. He checked it twice. He looked up. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have you on the guest list." Earl nodded. "I know. I didn't RSVP." Jennings shifted his weight. "Sir, this is an invitation-only event. I can't admit anyone who isn't on the list without authorization from Commander Hargrove." Earl looked past Jennings into the banquet hall. He could see round tables draped in white cloth, centerpieces with small American flags, and clusters of old men in blazers and service caps shaking hands and laughing. He could hear the low murmur of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. It looked exactly like what he had imagined it would look like, and for a moment he felt something tighten in his chest that might have been longing or might have been grief. "I understand," Earl said quietly. "Could you ask Commander Hargrove if he has a minute? Tell him it's Earl Briggs. He might remember the name." Jennings looked doubtful but nodded. "Wait here, sir." He spoke into his radio and relayed the message. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Jennings received a response and his expression did not change. "Sir, Commander Hargrove says he doesn't recognize the name and the event is at capacity. He suggests you contact the Veterans Association website to register for next year." Earl stood there for a moment. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has received exactly the answer he expected, and he turned to walk back toward the parking lot. He had taken about 15 steps when he heard a voice behind him. It was not Jennings. It was a different voice, older but sharp, the kind of voice that was used to giving orders in rooms where orders mattered. Hold on a second." Earl stopped and turned. A man in his early 60s was walking toward him from the banquet hall entrance. He was wearing a navy dress uniform with the insignia of a captain, and his name tag read, Patterson. Captain Alan Patterson had a thick grey moustache and the kind of tan that comes from spending decades on the bridge of a ship. He stopped about 6 feet from Earl and looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Did you say your name was Briggs?" Earl nodded. Patterson stared at him for a long moment. "Earl Briggs. Were you an aviator?" Earl said. "Yes." Patterson's eyes widened slightly. "What squadron?" Earl was quiet for a second, then he said, "VF 96. Fighting Falcons, 1971 to 74. Patterson took a step back. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked at Jennings, then back at Earl, and his voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "What was your call sign?" Earl looked at him. The wind from the harbour moved through the parking lot and pushed at his denim jacket, and for a moment he looked very old and very alone standing there on the concrete with his cracked boots and his too large shirt. Then he said one word. "Blackout." Captain Patterson did not move for approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, his face went through a series of changes that Jennings would later describe to his colleagues as the most unsettling thing he had ever seen a senior officer do. Patterson's jaw tightened. His eyes went wide. The colour rose in his face and then drained out of it. He took one step forward, and then he did something that made Jennings forget every protocol he had ever learned. Captain Alan Patterson, 32 years of commissioned service, former commanding officer of the guided missile cruiser USS Vicksburg, came to attention and saluted a 77-year-old man in a denim jacket. "My God," Patterson said. His voice was shaking. "You're alive." Earl did not return the salute immediately. He stood there looking at Patterson with those calm grey eyes. And something moved behind them, something old and deep, like a current shifting beneath still water. Then he raised his hand slowly and returned the salute with a precision that 50 years of civilian life had not erased. Patterson dropped his hand and reached for Earl's arm. "Come with me," he said. "Right now. Come with me." Earl said, "I wasn't invited." Patterson looked at him and said, "Lieutenant Commander Briggs, you were the invitation. Half the men in that room are alive because of you. You're coming inside if I have to carry you." Patterson walked Earl through the entrance past a stunned Jennings and into the banquet hall. The room was large and well lit, filled with approximately 400 people seated at round tables or standing in small groups near the buffet line and the bar. A stage at the far end held a podium with the USS Constellation crest and a large projection screen showing a slideshow of photographs from the ship's history. Most of the attendees were men in their 60s and 70s, many wearing veterans' caps or blazers with service pins. The noise level was considerable. Patterson guided Earl along the wall toward the front of the room, and as they walked, something began to happen. It started with a table near the entrance. An old man in a wheelchair looked up from his coffee, saw Earl's face, and went completely still. He reached over and gripped the arm of the man sitting next to him without looking away from Earl. That man turned, saw Earl, and his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, as if it were made of glass, and he stood up. At the next table, a retired chief petty officer named Davis, who had served as a plane captain during the Constellation's 1972 combat cruise, recognized Earl from 15 feet away and said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "That's Blackout. Dear God, that's Blackout." The name moved through the room the way fire moves through dry grass. Table by table, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Men who had not stood from their chairs all morning pushed themselves to their feet. Someone dropped a plate. Someone else said, "It can't be." A woman at one of the tables, the wife of a former radar intercept officer, looked at her husband and saw that he was crying and didn't understand why until he whispered, "That's the man who brought me home." At the head table, Rear Admiral David Chen was in the middle of reviewing his keynote remarks when he became aware that the room had gone quiet. Chen was 68 years old, a decorated officer who had retired 3 years earlier after a distinguished career that included command of a carrier strike group. He was the highest-ranking attendee at the reunion and had been invited to deliver the keynote address about the legacy of carrier aviation. He looked up from his notes and saw the crowd parting, saw Patterson walking a thin old man in a denim jacket toward the front of the room, and saw that men were standing as the old man passed. Chen did not recognize the face. He had not served on the Constellation himself. But he recognized the reaction. He had seen that kind of reaction once before in his career, at a ceremony where a Medal of Honor recipient had walked into a room unannounced. He turned to the retired captain sitting beside him and said, "Who is that?" The captain, a former Constellation Air Wing commander named Morrison, was already standing. His face was white. He looked at Chen and said 3 words. "That's Blackout, Admiral." Chen stared at him. "Blackout, as in Operation Blackout." Morrison nodded. Chen pushed his chair back and stood so quickly that he knocked over his water glass. The water spread across the white tablecloth and no one moved to clean it up. No one was looking at the water. Everyone was looking at Earl. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Operation Blackout was, and to understand that, you need to understand what the skies over North Vietnam were like in the spring of 1972. The North Vietnamese air defense network was, by that point in the war, one of the most sophisticated and deadly integrated defense systems ever faced by American aviators. It combined Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, early warning radar stations and MiG interceptors into a layered network designed to make the skies above Hanoi and Haiphong into a killing ground. American pilots called it the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, and they were not exaggerating. During Operation Linebacker, the sustained bombing campaign that began in May of 1972, Navy and Air Force aviators flew into that network day after day, and the losses were staggering. Aircraft were being shot down at a rate that threatened to exhaust both airframes and the men who flew them. The key to the North Vietnamese system was its radar. Without radar, the SAM batteries were firing blind. Without radar, the MiGs could not be vectored to intercept incoming strikes. Without radar, the anti-aircraft guns lost their fire control solutions. Take out the radar, and the entire network degraded dramatically. The problem was that the radar stations were among the most heavily defended targets in the country. They were ringed with guns, protected by their own SAM batteries, and often located in areas where the terrain made approach extremely dangerous. Hitting them required flying directly into the teeth of the defences they controlled, which was roughly equivalent to asking a man to disarm a bomb by climbing inside it. Earl Briggs was an F-4 Phantom pilot assigned to VF-96 aboard the USS Constellation, and his specialty was something that most aviators considered either extraordinarily brave or completely insane. He flew Iron Hand missions. Iron Hand was the designation for flights specifically tasked with suppressing enemy air defences, which in practice meant flying ahead of the main strike package, deliberately triggering the enemy radar to get them to turn on their systems, and then attacking the radar sites and SAM batteries with anti-radiation missiles and bombs before the main strike force arrived. The Iron Hand crews went in first. They went in low, they went in fast, and they went in knowing that the entire purpose of their mission was to make themselves a target. Earl was exceptionally good at this. His radar intercept officer, a lieutenant named James Jimmy Oakes, had an almost supernatural ability to detect and classify radar emissions, and together they developed techniques for approaching SAM sites that reduced their exposure window to bare seconds. Earl's call sign, Blackout, was given to him by his squadron mates because of his preferred tactic, which was to approach targets at extremely low altitude, using terrain masking and timing his attacks for the moments just before dawn or just after dusk when visual detection was most difficult. He operated in the spaces between light and dark, and the North Vietnamese radar operators learned to fear the moments when their screens went blank, because it meant Blackout was already inside their perimeter. In May of 1972, Navy intelligence identified a cluster of 3 radar stations northwest of Haiphong that formed the backbone of the early warning network covering the approaches to the port. These stations were responsible for detecting incoming strike packages and vectoring both SAM batteries and MiG interceptors to intercept them. Taking out these 3 stations would create a gap in the radar coverage large enough to allow a major strike against the Haiphong port facilities with significantly reduced opposition. The mission was designated Operation Blackout, named not for the call sign but for the intended result, a temporary blackout of the enemy radar network. Earl Briggs was assigned to lead the Iron Hand element, a flight of 4 F-4 Phantoms tasked with destroying all 3 stations in a single coordinated strike. The mission planning took 6 days. The complexity was extraordinary. Each station was defended by multiple SAM batteries and anti-aircraft positions, and the 3 stations were positioned so that they provided overlapping coverage, meaning an attack on one would immediately alert the others. The flight would have to hit all 3 within a window of approximately 90 seconds to prevent the surviving stations from alerting the broader network and vectoring additional defences into the area. Earl studied the target folders until he could draw the terrain from memory. He calculated approach routes, escape corridors, and timing sequences down to individual seconds. He briefed his flight 3 times. Jimmy Oakes spent hours analysing intercepted radar emissions to identify the exact frequencies and pulse repetition rates of each station so they could program their anti-radiation missiles for maximum accuracy. They launched before dawn on the morning of May 14th, 4 Phantoms loaded with Shrike anti-radiation missiles and cluster bombs, flying at 200 feet above the Gulf of Tonkin in total radio silence. The plan called for a coordinated pop-up attack, with each 2-plane element hitting their assigned targets simultaneously. Earl and his wingman would take the 2 southern stations. The second element would hit the northern station. Timing was everything. If one element was late by even 30 seconds, the surviving station would have time to alert Haiphong Air Defense Command, and the entire area would light up with every SAM and gun in range. They crossed the coast at 5:20 in the morning, just as the first grey light was touching the horizon. Earl could see the dark shapes of the karst mountains ahead, the jagged limestone formations that rose out of the delta like broken teeth. He took his element down to 150 feet and threaded through a valley that his intelligence package showed was a gap in the overlapping radar coverage. Jimmy Oakes was in the back seat, his eyes locked on the radar warning receiver, calling out threats in a voice that was steady and almost conversational. SA-2 tracking radar, 10 o'clock, 20 miles, not painting us, fan song signal weak, we're below their beam. Earl pushed the throttles forward and felt the Phantom surge beneath him. They were moving at over 500 knots, and at that altitude the ground was a green blur punctuated by the occasional flash of water from rice paddies. The timing had to be perfect. At 5:23, Earl pulled up sharply, climbing through 1,000 feet in seconds, and as the aircraft's nose rose above the terrain, Jimmy called out the radar contact. Fan song, 12 o'clock, 8 miles, tracking. The radar station had found them. Earl could see the Shrike missile's seeker head come alive on his weapons panel, locking onto the enemy radar emission like a bloodhound catching a scent. He pressed the firing button and felt the missile drop away and ignite, streaking toward the source of the signal. Before the Shrike had covered half the distance, Earl had rolled the Phantom into a hard turn and was diving back toward the valley floor, pulling 6 Gs that pressed him into his seat with the force of a car wreck. Behind him, the Shrike found its target. The explosion was visible as a brief orange flash against the grey sky. The first station was down. His wingman, Lieutenant Commander Pete Driscoll, hit the second station 32 seconds later. A textbook attack that put a cluster bomb pattern directly across the radar antenna and its control van. 2 down. Earl keyed his radio for the first time, breaking the silence with a single word. Splash. The second element, 30 miles to the north, heard the call and executed their own attack. But something went wrong. The northern station had been alerted not by radar but by visual observation. A North Vietnamese lookout had spotted the aircraft contrails against the lightening sky and phoned ahead. When the second element popped up for their attack run, they flew directly into a barrage of optically guided anti-aircraft fire. The lead aircraft took multiple hits almost immediately. The pilot, Lieutenant Bill Scanlon, called out on the radio that he was hit, that he had fire warning lights, that he was losing hydraulics. His weapons officer managed to fire their Shrike before the aircraft became uncontrollable, and the missile found the radar antenna, but the Phantom was done. Scanlon and his backseater ejected over hostile territory 5 miles northwest of the target. Earl heard the Mayday call and did something that was not in the mission plan. He was supposed to egress to the coast and return to the carrier. The radar stations were destroyed. The mission was accomplished. But Bill Scanlon and his weapons officer were on the ground in enemy territory, and Earl knew that the North Vietnamese were fast. Recovery teams could be on site within 30 minutes. Search and rescue helicopters would take at least an hour to arrive from the fleet. Someone needed to keep the enemy away from those 2 men until the helicopters arrived. Earl turned his aircraft north. Jimmy Oakes did not say anything. He did not need to. They had been flying together for 14 months, and Jimmy knew what Earl was going to do before Earl said it. Earl flew to the area where Scanlon had gone down, and began flying low-altitude orbits over the downed cruise position, using his aircraft as a shield. He had expended his Shrike missiles on the radar stations, but he still had his 20mm cannon and a few hundred rounds of ammunition. When a North Vietnamese patrol began moving toward the ejection site, Earl rolled in and strafed the tree line, scattering the troops. He made 4 strafing runs over the next 45 minutes, each time pulling up through a curtain of small arms fire that punched holes through his wings and fuselage. On the third run, a round came through the canopy rail and missed Jimmy Oakes's helmet by less than 2 inches. On the fourth run, the aircraft took a hit in the left engine, and Earl shut it down and continued on single-engine power. He stayed over those men for almost an hour. He stayed until the rescue helicopters arrived. He stayed until he saw the helicopters extract both Scanlon and his weapons officer. Then he flew his damaged single-engine Phantom back to the Constellation and put it on the deck with barely enough fuel to taxi to the elevator. Bill Scanlon survived. His weapons officer survived. The 3 radar stations were destroyed, and the resulting gap in coverage allowed the strike on Haiphong to proceed 3 days later with dramatically reduced losses. The post-mission analysis credited Operation Blackout with saving an estimated 20 to 30 aircraft and their crews over the following 2 weeks of operations. Earl Briggs was recommended for the Navy Cross for his actions that day, specifically for the unauthorized decision to remain over hostile territory to protect the downed crew. The recommendation was approved, Earl flew 37 more combat missions before the Constellation completed her deployment and returned to San Diego. During those missions, he was credited with the suppression or destruction of 11 radar sites and 4 SAM batteries, and he was involved in an aerial engagement in which his flight downed 2 MiG-21s, though Earl himself did not fire the killing shots. By any measure, he was one of the most effective Iron Hand pilots in the Navy during one of the most intense periods of aerial combat since World War II. And then he came home, and he stopped talking about it. The transition was not easy, and Earl would be the first to admit that if you ever got him to talk about it at all, which almost no one did. He left the Navy in 1975 and returned to Virginia. He tried to go back to the life he had known before the service, but the life he had known before the service belonged to a younger man who had not yet learned what it felt like to kill people and to watch his friends die. He married a woman named Susan in 1977, and they had 1 daughter, and the marriage lasted 11 years before Susan told him that she loved him, but she could not live with a man who woke up screaming 3 nights a week and would not tell her why. The divorce was quiet. Earl did not contest it. He moved into the apartment above the hardware store in Chesapeake and began the long, slow process of becoming invisible. He worked odd jobs. He fixed things for people. He read his westerns and drank his black coffee and told no one about the things he had done in the skies over North Vietnam. He did not attend reunions. He did not join veterans' organizations. He did not seek treatment for the nightmares that continued with diminishing frequency for the next 3 decades. Jimmy Oakes, his radar intercept officer, called him every year on the anniversary of Operation Blackout until 1998, when Jimmy died of a heart attack at the age of 54. After that, no one called. Earl's daughter visited him twice a year, at Christmas and on his birthday, and she loved him very much, but she understood that there were rooms inside her father that he had locked shut and that she was not going to be the one to open them. Now Earl stood at the head table in the Norfolk Naval Station banquet hall, and the room was silent in a way that 400 people in a banquet hall are almost never silent. Rear Admiral Chen had come around the table and was standing directly in front of him. Chen was not a man who was easily shaken. He had commanded warships in combat zones. He had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of sailors, but he was standing in front of a legend, and he knew it, and his face showed it. "Lieutenant Commander Briggs," Chen said, and his voice carried across the silent room. "I'm Admiral David Chen. I've studied Operation Blackout at the War College. It is taught as one of the finest examples of tactical planning and personal courage in the history of naval aviation." Earl looked at him. "It was just a mission, Admiral." Chen shook his head slowly. "No, sir. It was not just a mission. You went back for those men when you didn't have to. You stayed when every piece of logic said to leave. That's not a mission. That's a choice. And it's the kind of choice that defines what this Navy is supposed to be." Chen turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, some of you know this man. Some of you served with him. Some of you are here today because of what he did on May 14th, 1972. For those who don't know, I am standing next to Lieutenant Commander Earl Briggs, callsign Blackout, Navy Cross recipient, who led Operation Blackout and then voluntarily remained over hostile territory for nearly an hour to protect a downed crew, flying a damaged aircraft through enemy fire until rescue arrived. The room erupted. There's no other word for it. 400 people began clapping and shouting, and some of them were crying, and some of them were trying to do all 3 at once. Men who had not seen Earl in 50 years were pushing through the crowd to reach him. Bill Scanlon, now 80 years old and walking with a cane, was making his way from a table near the back, and his face was a map of everything he had never been able to say to the man who had saved his life. Chen pulled out his own chair at the head table and guided Earl into it. "This is your seat, Commander. It always was." Earl sat down slowly. He looked at the white tablecloth, the small American flag in the centerpiece, the water glass that someone had refilled after Chen knocked his over. He looked at the faces around him, old faces marked by time and weather, and the specific kind of wear that comes from carrying memories that most people cannot imagine. And for the first time in a very long time, Earl Briggs did not feel alone. Bill Scanlon reached the table and stood there, leaning on his cane, looking at Earl with eyes that were bright and full. "Earl," he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. 50 years. I looked for you. We all looked for you." Earl looked up at him. "I know, Bill. I wasn't ready." Scanlon nodded. He understood. Every man in that room understood. They understood the weight and the silence and the years of carrying something too heavy to share and too important to put down. Scanlan reached out his hand and Earl took it, and they held on to each other the way men hold on to each other when the grip is the only thing keeping the past from pulling them under. "You brought me home," Scanlan said. "You and Jimmy, you brought me home." Earl's jaw tightened and his eyes glistened, and he said, "Jimmy should be here." Scanlan nodded. "He is, Earl. Believe me, he is." The keynote address that Admiral Chen had prepared was about the legacy of carrier aviation, but he set his notes aside and spoke instead about something else. He spoke about the men who serve in silence. He spoke about the ones who do the hardest jobs, and then come home and disappear into the ordinary rhythms of civilian life without asking for recognition or gratitude or even acknowledgement. He spoke about how the military is built on the visible things, the uniforms and the ranks and the ceremonies, but how it runs on the invisible things, the decisions made at 3 in the morning in a cockpit over hostile territory, the choice to turn toward danger instead of away from it, the willingness to trade your own safety for someone else's life. He spoke about Earl Briggs without using his name at first, describing a pilot who flew into the most dangerous airspace on Earth and made it his workplace, who destroyed the systems designed to kill his comrades, and who then stayed behind to protect the men who fell. And then he said Earl's name, and the room stood again. Chen looked at Earl and said, "Commander Briggs, on behalf of everyone in this room, and on behalf of every crew that made it home safely because of the gaps you blew in their defences, thank you. You deserved to hear that a long time ago. We should have found you sooner. But you're here now, and that's what matters." Earl did not stand. He did not make a speech. He nodded once, the same slow nod he had given Jennings at the door, but this time it meant something different. This time it meant acceptance. This time it meant that the locked door inside him had finally, after 50 years, opened just wide enough to let a little light through. The rest of the afternoon unfolded the way these things unfold when old warriors gather and the barriers come down. Men told stories. They filled in the gaps in each other's memories. They laughed about things that were not funny at the time and went quiet about things that were never going to be funny. A retired Master Chief who had been an aircraft mechanic on the Constellation told Earl that he had personally patched the holes in his Phantom after Operation Blackout and counted 37 separate bullet and shrapnel impacts. "I told my chief that aircraft should have been surveyed," he said. "Struck from the inventory. No way it should have flown again, but they patched it up and you took it back out 3 days later. I thought you were out of your mind." Earl almost smiled at that. "The airplane worked," he said. "That's all I needed to know." Pete Driscoll, Earl's wingman during the operation, had passed away in 2016, but his son was at the reunion, a Navy lieutenant commander himself, and he found Earl and introduced himself. "My father talked about you every single year on the anniversary," he said. "He said you were the best pilot he ever flew with and the worst man to try to have a beer with because you never said more than 6 words at a time." Earl looked at the young man who had his father's jaw and his father's steady eyes and said, "Your father was a fine aviator and a better man than I'll ever be. You tell his grandchildren that." Commander Hargrove, who had turned Earl away at the door, came to the head table personally. His face was flushed and his manner was stiff with the particular kind of embarrassment that comes from realizing you have made a significant mistake. "Commander Briggs, I owe you an apology. I should have recognized the name. I should have done more due diligence on the historical roster." Earl looked at him and said, "You were doing your job, Commander. No apology needed." But Hargrove was not finished. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to make you a permanent honorary member of the Veterans Association, and I'd like to retire your seat at the head table for every future reunion, whether you attend or not." Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like that." Something else happened that afternoon that Earl did not expect. His daughter Karen arrived. It turned out that Captain Patterson, after walking Earl into the banquet hall, had found Earl's emergency contact information through the VA system and called Karen to tell her where her father was and what was happening. Karen drove from Richmond in just over 2 hours, and when she walked into the banquet hall she saw her father sitting at the head table, surrounded by men who were treating him with the kind of reverence she had never seen directed at the quiet man who fixed things and read westerns and drank black coffee. She stood at the edge of the room for a moment watching, trying to reconcile the father she knew with the man these people were describing. Then Earl saw her. He stood up from his chair slowly the way he did everything, and he looked at her across the room and his face changed. The careful neutrality that he wore like armour softened, and Karen saw something she had only seen a handful of times in her entire life. She saw her father's eyes fill with tears. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held her. And he said something to her that she would later tell her own children about. He said, "I'm sorry I never told you. I thought if I kept it buried it would stop hurting. But it doesn't stop. It just gets lonely." Karen held him tighter. "You don't have to be lonely anymore, Dad." And Earl, for the first time in 50 years, believed that might be true. In the weeks following the reunion, several things happened. Admiral Chen personally contacted the Navy's Bureau of Personnel and requested that Earl's complete service record be reviewed and properly archived, including the full documentation of Operation Blackout and the Navy Cross Citation, which had been misfiled during the post-war records consolidation. The USS Constellation Veterans Association established an annual award in Earl's name, the Blackout Award, to be given each year to the reunion attendee who best exemplified quiet service and selfless dedication. Earl began attending a veterans support group at the VA clinic in Norfolk, not because anyone told him to, but because he had finally learned something that he should have learned decades ago, that the weight is easier to carry when you're not carrying it alone. He spoke at the group's meetings occasionally, never for long, never with more words than were necessary, but the words he used had the kind of weight that comes from half a century of silence, and the other veterans in the room listened to him the way you listen to a man who has been to the bottom of something deep and found his way back. Bill Scanlon and Earl talked on the phone every Sunday morning after the reunion. They talked about the weather and about baseball and about their grandchildren, and they did not often talk about the war, but the war was there in every conversation the way the Foundation is there in every house, invisible but holding everything up. Karen visited her father more often, and during one visit she noticed that the apartment above the hardware store had changed. The bare walls now held several framed photographs. The old one near the kitchen window was still there, the young man on the carrier deck, but it had been joined by others. A group photo from the reunion, a picture of Earl and Scanlon shaking hands, a photo of Jimmy Oakes that someone had found in the squadron archives and sent to Earl in the mail. The apartment still smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, but it no longer felt like a room where a man went to be alone. It felt like a room where a man lived. Petty Officer Jennings, the young security guard who had turned Earl away at the door, sought Earl out before the reunion ended. He was 23 years old and newly assigned to the base, and he stood in front of Earl with the kind of rigid posture that young sailors adopt when they are deeply uncomfortable and trying not to show it. "Sir, I want to apologize for earlier. I had no idea who you were." Earl looked at him the way he looked at everyone, with those calm grey eyes that had seen the worst the world could offer, and decided to keep looking anyway. "Son, you don't owe me an apology. You were following procedure. That's what you're supposed to do." Jennings hesitated. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Earl nodded. "What's it like? Being a pilot, I mean. Flying like that." Earl was quiet for a long time, long enough that Jennings thought he might not answer. Then he said, "It's the loneliest feeling in the world and the most connected feeling in the world all at the same time. You're up there alone, but everything you do affects the people below you, beside you, behind you. Every decision you make either keeps someone alive or doesn't. That's what it's like." He paused. "And the sky is beautiful. Even when people are trying to kill you, the sky's the most beautiful thing you'll ever see." Jennings stood there for a moment, and then he came to attention and saluted, the way Patterson had saluted in the parking lot, and Earl returned it, and that was the end of their conversation. But Jennings would carry those words for the rest of his career, and years later, when he had his own command and his own young sailors who needed to understand what service meant, he would tell them about the day he almost turned away a legend at the door. Earl Briggs drove home that evening as the sun was setting over the Chesapeake Bay. He took the long way, down Route 17, where the road follows the water and the light at that hour turns everything gold and copper. He drove with his window down and the radio off, and the only sound was the wind and the tyres on the road. He was 77 years old. His knees ached. His lungs were not what they used to be. He had spent 50 years locked inside a silence that he had mistaken for strength, and in a single afternoon he had learned that strength was not about what you could endure alone, but about what you were willing to share. He pulled into his parking spot behind the hardware store and sat in the truck for a few minutes, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the page he had torn from the Veterans magazine 3 weeks earlier. the one with the photograph of the constellation. He looked at it one more time, folded it carefully and put it back. He would keep it. Not because he needed it to remember the ship or the missions or the men. He would keep it because it was the thing that had finally brought him home. He climbed out of the truck, walked slowly up the stairs to his apartment, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he left the door open behind him. Not because he was expecting anyone, but because he was done shutting the world out. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that real heroes don't always wear their medals on the outside. Some carry them in silence for decades, waiting for the moment when someone finally asks the right question. Earl Briggs waited 50 years. When they asked for his call sign, and he said Blackout, the whole room remembered. Share this story with someone who served, someone who sacrificed, someone who carried the weight in silence. Because every hero deserves to be seen, and every warrior deserves to come home.